everyone, welcome to your deep dive.
Right.
We're tackling a topic today that I know you've been eager to hear more about: self-inflicted injuries. And let me tell you, this forensic pathology text we're using as our guide is seriously fascinating.
Oh, it is. Prepare to be surprised. We're really going in depth this time, going way beyond the surface of these injuries to understand the motivations and the nuances. Things get pretty complicated.
I'm ready for it. So the text jumps right in, laying out 5 main categories of non-accidental self-inflicted injuries. First up, we've got suicidal acts, both attempts and gestures.
Right.
And then there's the kind of crazy one, self-harm for insurance fraud. Can you believe people do that?
Oh, it happens more than you'd think. But yeah,
Yeah.
each category we'll be looking at, they all have these unique motivations behind them, which makes figuring out the story behind the injury that much more challenging.
It's like a puzzle, isn't it? And speaking of puzzles, we've also got self-harm among soldiers and prisoners.
Another layer of complexity.
And then, of course, we have self-mutilation in psychiatric patients, which adds a whole other dimension to the conversation.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting, I think, because when you start talking about mental health and these more extreme forms of self-harm, it really highlights the challenges that forensic professionals face. They're the ones on the front lines trying to make sense of these injuries.
And it's not always easy, right? I mean, the text really drives home how tough it can be to determine the intent behind an injury. Like, was this an accident? Was it self-inflicted? Or was it something more sinister?
It's a huge responsibility because that distinction, it can literally make or break a homicide investigation. Someone's life, someone's freedom could be on the line based on how they interpret those injuries.
Talk about pressure. But I'm curious, why is it so difficult to tell sometimes? You'd think a self-inflicted wound would look different from, say, an attack, right?
Well, you'd hope so. But the truth is, the human body is complicated, and the way it reacts to trauma, it's not always predictable. A wound that looks self-inflicted could have been caused by someone else, and vice versa.
Okay, so if you can't always tell just by looking, what are investigators looking for? What are the clues that help them decode these injuries?
It's like putting together a puzzle, really. They start by looking at the characteristics of the wound itself, the depth, the angle, the location.
Makes sense.
Then they consider the scene. Were there any weapons involved? Are there signs of a struggle? And if there are any witnesses, what are they saying? But they also have to dig into the individual's history. Do they have a history of mental health issues or previous self-harm? Is there anything in their life, any stressors, that might provide context for their state of mind?
So it's not just about the physical evidence. It's about understanding the person behind the injury.
Exactly. It's about seeing the big picture, not just focusing on one piece of the puzzle.
So we're talking about putting together this giant puzzle, right?
Yeah.
And when it comes to these self-inflicted injuries, I have to imagine some methods are easier to figure out than others.
Oh, absolutely. And the text actually goes through several different methods, starting with, well, the most obvious one, I guess, suicide. They talk about everything from cutting and firearms to drowning and burning and asphyxiation.
Asphyxiation.
Yeah.
That's like what? Death from lack of oxygen, right?
Exactly. Basically anything that cuts off your airway or prevents you from breathing properly.
Got it. So the text mentions all these different suicide methods. Were there any statistics that jumped out at you?
Yeah, well, there's this one that's kind of wild. Did you know that female firearm suicides are super rare in Britain?
Really? That's interesting. Why is that?
Well, it all comes down to access. Firearms are way less common in Britain compared to, say, the United States. So naturally, you're going to see that reflected in the suicide statistics as well.
That makes sense. It's a good reminder that these things aren't happening in a vacuum. There's always a bigger context. But okay, let's dive into some specifics. The text talks about suicidal knife wounds, and it keeps mentioning these sites of election. What does that even mean?
It sounds way more dramatic than it actually is. It just refers to the areas of the body that are most commonly targeted in those types of suicides.
So we're talking like specific body parts.
Exactly. We're usually talking about the throat, wrists, or the chest. And even then, there are some gender differences. Men are more likely to go for the throat or chest, while wrist cutting tends to be a bit more evenly split between genders.
Interesting. And then there's that whole thing about the tentative incisions, like those little hesitation cuts you sometimes see around a larger wound. It's like they're trying to work up the courage or something.
Yeah, it can be a pretty strong indicator of a potential suicide. But here's the thing, and this is really important. They're not foolproof.
Wait, so you're saying even something that seems like a clear sign of self-harm can be misleading?
Unfortunately, yeah. The text actually mentions a couple of murder cases where the killer tried to stage it as a suicide by adding those tentative cuts to make it look more convincing.
That's messed up. Okay, so you really can't underestimate the importance of context. But let's say we are looking at a possible suicide by knife wound. What else are investigators looking for? Like, how deep is the wound? What direction was the cut made in?
All of that matters. For example, a classic suicidal cutthroat, we're talking about someone who's right-handed, usually it'll be deeper on the left side of the neck and then get shallower as it goes to the right.
Because they're slicing across their own throat.
Exactly. But of course, it's not always that clear-cut in real life. People move around, they struggle, and all of that can impact the final appearance of the wound.
So even within a single method like cutting, there's a lot of variation and nuance.
Absolutely. And you can't forget, with a cutthroat, the actual cause of death can be different depending on what gets hit. A severed artery, you're talking about bleeding out. A cut to the airway, that's asphyxiation. Investigators have to consider every possibility.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How one type of injury can have so many different outcomes.
Yeah, it really highlights the complexity of these cases.
Okay, so let's move on to another method. Gunshot wounds. What are some of the key things investigators look at in those cases?
Well, the first thing they want to know is there even a gun present? Sounds obvious, but it's crucial information.
To rule out someone else doing it. Right?
Exactly. And then they're looking at things like, could the person even reach the trigger? Especially if it's, say, a gunshot wound to the head, they need to consider the individual's arm length, their position, the type of weapon. And then there's the wound itself, the location, the angle, the distance of the shot. All of those details matter.
So it's like a puzzle where every piece gives you a little more information.
Exactly. Now, with gunshot wounds, some of the most common locations for self-inflicted injuries are the temple, the mouth, under the chin, and the chest. But again, you can't make assumptions. Just because someone is right-handed doesn't mean they use their right hand to fire the gun.
Good point. You can't jump to conclusions.
Nope. You got to look at all the evidence.
Speaking of evidence, the text also talks about some of the other suicide methods we mentioned earlier, like drowning, burning, asphyxiation. With drowning, it seems like location is a big factor.
Yeah, totally. You're much more likely to see drowning suicides in areas with easy access to water, lakes, rivers, oceans, that kind of thing.
Makes sense. And burning, that seems less common, at least from what I've heard.
It is less common in a lot of Western countries, but unfortunately it does happen. And sometimes high-profile cases, like self-immolation protests, can lead to copycat suicides.
That's so sad. It's like a tragic reminder of the power of influence and suggestion.
It is. And finally, we have asphyxiation, which can involve a lot of different methods. The text mentioned that plastic bag suicides have been on the rise in recent years, which is pretty disturbing to think about.
Yeah, it's scary how accessible some of those methods are, and how something that seems so harmless on the surface can be used in such a tragic way.
It really makes you think. And it reminds us that while we've covered a lot about suicide today, the world of self-inflicted injuries goes far beyond that one category.
It's like we could spend a whole other episode just talking about suicide, and we still wouldn't scratch the surface.
Oh, absolutely. And don't forget, the text also covers self-inflicted injuries that have nothing to do with suicide, which is a whole other can of worms.
Right, so if someone's hurting themselves, but it's not about suicide, what's going on there? What's driving that behavior?
It's complicated, and it's usually not just one thing. But a lot of times, mental health plays a big role. You know, some people, when they're struggling emotionally, it manifests physically.
Yeah, I've heard that. It's like their emotional pain is so intense, they need a physical outlet for it.
Exactly. And then there's the attention-seeking aspect. For some people, self-harm is a way to cry for help, to get noticed, to get the support they desperately need.
It's like a really unhealthy coping mechanism.
Exactly. And sometimes it's about escaping a situation. Like the text mentioned prisoners who might injure themselves to get medical attention so they can avoid solitary confinement or some other kind of hardship.
Wow. So it's like a last resort for them.
In a way, yeah. And then you've got the really manipulative cases. The text specifically talks about Munchausen syndrome, which is where someone intentionally harms themselves to get medical attention.
Wait, seriously? Just for the attention?
It's a real thing, and it's a wild one. It's all about craving that caregiving, that sympathy, the whole drama of being a patient.
That is just... yeah. And that's got to be a tough one for doctors to figure out, right?
Oh, absolutely. Especially because the person with Munchausen's, they're often very good at manipulating situations and people. But it gets even darker.
Darker? How?
Munchausen syndrome by proxy. That's where someone, usually a parent, harms their child to get that same medical attention.
Oh my God. That's just evil.
It's horrific, and a lot of times forensic pathologists are the ones who end up uncovering those cases, which is why their work is so crucial.
Because they're looking at the evidence, at the injuries themselves, and they can tell something's not right.
Exactly. It takes a trained eye to spot those inconsistencies, those red flags that might otherwise be missed.
Okay, so we've talked about the why, but what about the how? Like, how can investigators tell if an injury is self-inflicted, especially if it's not an obvious suicide attempt?
That's where those forensic details we keep talking about come in. The text lays out some key characteristics that investigators look for. Think of it like a checklist, but it's not foolproof. These are just things that raise their eyebrows and make them look a little closer.
Okay, so what's on this checklist? What are some of the telltale signs?
Well, for one, self-inflicted cuts tend to be more superficial. They're hesitant wounds.
Because the person's not really trying to kill themselves.
Right. And the pattern of the cuts is important too. Self-inflicted cuts, they usually have this more regular pattern, like they were made with the same amount of pressure from start to finish.
As opposed to a struggle where the cuts might be more erratic.
Exactly. And another thing they look at is the location of the injuries. People are naturally inclined to protect certain areas, so self-inflicted wounds, they often avoid the eyes, the lips, the nose.
Yeah, makes sense. No one wants to accidentally blind themselves.
Right. And then there's the whole dominant hand thing. Like if someone's right-handed and the injuries are on their left arm, it could suggest they were inflicted with their own right hand.
Oh, I see. It's like they're trying to figure out the mechanics of how the injury happened.
Exactly. And here's one you might not expect. Clothing. Investigators always look at the clothing for any inconsistencies.
Like if the clothes are ripped or cut in a way that doesn't match the injury.
Exactly. If it seems like the clothes were moved or tampered with after the injury happened, that's a big red flag.
It's like in those crime dramas. Clothes never lie. But this is real life. It's amazing how much goes into these investigations.
Oh, it's incredibly detailed work. They're looking at every little thing because you never know what tiny detail might crack the case wide open.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered so much ground today, from the different methods of suicide to the motivations behind non-suicidal self-harm and everything in between.
We really went deep. But I think the biggest takeaway here is just how complex these cases are. There's rarely a simple answer, and you can't judge a book by its cover, or I guess an injury by its appearance.
Exactly. So the next time you hear about a mysterious injury in the news, or maybe you see a cut on someone's arm and you're not sure what to make of it, remember this conversation. There might be a lot more going on beneath the surface than you realize. And sometimes the most important clues are the ones that are the hardest to see.